It says we are live, and the answer to your question, Dragon Lair, is yes. Nate has to get off work early. If I had all the time I wait on Bob, you weren't waiting on Bob, you were waiting on the guest, and he's been here less than 1 minute. So sorry, we made it 7:35 to try and accommodate impatient people. So, and Susie Q popped off, so now we're adding her back in.
Hello. It was a StreamYard kept trying to get me to log in. So finally I click log in and boom, everything went off.
Well, you see, Dragon Lair said we've taken a year off his life, so
I won't touch any more buttons.
There we go. All right. Well, everybody knows who Nate is, and I'm going to go ahead and bring him up.
Yeah, baby.
And let him get started because this is much anticipated. And hey, everybody in the chat, and hey, members, and Susie, and mods. So here we go. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, thank you.
And congratulations on your
thank you. I'm super glad to have that schooling done. It was definitely a challenge, but it was one that was well worth it.
What was the schooling?
So I am now officially a master herpetologist.
Sweet.
I know, right?
Do we have to call you master?
There's probably somebody out there that wants to.
That's right.
That's
all right. Well, I figured today we would talk about substrate. The last couple of weeks, especially as I've been kind of trying to get things back in order over here after doing all the school, is that I've noticed that there's a lot of people that just have substrates that maybe they could improve on. There's definitely numerous substrates that you can use, but there are some that tend to work better for different species than others. So one that I see a lot of people use, and the primary reason... Is that a false water cobra? Yes, it is. So this is Hydrodynastes gigas. This is Carita. And she has grown quite a bit since I got her. We are almost to the year mark. She is going to be 1 year old in May on the 4th.
Oh, wow. May the 4th be with her.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Hey there, pretty girl.
So I figured that we'd have her out today so she can get more of her handling in. She definitely is one of those snakes that the better the bond you can build with them, the better the time it is to keep them. And she does really well anyway, but just to really help keep that established and have her learn good habits and good behaviors when I'm handling her, and especially when I have to do things like presentations or anything like that, I'd like for her to be kind of used to just being out for, longer periods of time. But one of the most common substrates that I see people use, and it's one that I try to urge people to move away from, even for drier climate species, is aspen. I see a lot of people use aspen for things like ball pythons, for boas, for once in a great while I'll see someone put a false water cobra on aspen. Not super often, but here and there. I'll even see things like corn snakes and different kinds of rat snakes, king snakes on aspen. And one of the issues that I have with that particular substrate is that it's very prone to molding. It does not do very well with bacterial and fungal growth, especially if there's any kind of moisture. So if the snake has to use the bathroom, or if you have to have higher humidity for that animal to help with their respiration and shedding cycles and things like that, that substrate is really prone to just have fungal blooms, and it gets pretty gnarly, which can then cause other issues as well. So even if you're not struggling at that point with humidity, but you've got the fungal growth, and there could be different kinds of mycological related issues that you can run across, which is never a good time, like respiratory infections and things like that. And especially with funguses, they can become pretty chronic and quite the issue. Yeah, I don't like the way that you're pressing into my arm there. I need you to not do that. There you go.
Do you keep any live food, like any live rodents for food?
No. So all of my foods are going to be frozen thawed and just in the freezer. So that way I can, in some situations, like with the chicken liver that I feed to her, I can pre-portion it out and just have it ready to go in a little bag. And then all I've got to do when it's time to feed these guys is just take them out and let it sit out for a while at room temp or put it in the fridge the night before. And then usually I feed on Wednesdays. Come Wednesday, I can just pull it out of there and get it all situated for these guys.
Well, I do that same process as much as I can, but I do have some critters that won't eat frozen thawed, and I use aspen is where I was going with that for my mice and rats. And I just wonder if I should be using that and then giving them to the snakes.
I think for mice and rats, aspen might be okay. I'm not very well versed on small mammals. I've seen a number of people use aspen, and I've seen other substrates as well for rodents. So I don't know that it causes necessarily the same issues. I would imagine that there's probably some kind of carryover, and there probably are better alternatives to aspen for rodents. But for that, I would probably kind of lean more towards looking into someone that has more experience with. And for me, even though they would be feeders, I would look at someone that raises pet quality animals. So especially someone that's breeding like and as odd as it is, there are show rats and mice that have to be taken very well care of. So that way they're nice and healthy when they go to present these animals at whatever kind of competitions and things that they're doing. So that would be kind of the thing that I would look towards, is finding someone that's really specialized in small mammals like rodents, particularly rodents, and specifically whatever kind of feeder you're keeping, whether it be mice or rats or what have you. So that way you can really get in depth with things like maximum nutrition to keep the feeder animal healthy, which will then in turn offer a much healthier feeder for the animal that you're feeding them to.
Oh, cool. Pine and cedar are bad for small mammals. Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. Right on. I know that pine is one, especially that you have to avoid for snakes because of the astringent compounds that are in the, I guess, sap of the trees that those come from. They can really wreak havoc on the respiratory system, and especially for animals like blood pythons and higher humidity animals that may have like a more sensitive respiratory tract where they can't really have a whole lot of other stuff going on. You have to keep them really clean, things like that. Those guys can really end up having some issues with things like pine and anything that gets a little bit too dusty. So a great alternative to aspen is going to be cocoa husk. So that's going to be the large, chunky. I've got several enclosures that have that in there. See if I can get a hold of any without making too terribly big of a mess. This guy out of the way here. But that can be used with high humidity animals, and it can even be used with lower humidity animals. I don't necessarily know that it would work super great for something like a desert species, but definitely like North American colubrids, you can use that. You can use it for ball pythons. You can use it for false water cobras. You can use it for blood pythons, boas, just about any kind of snake you can use this with pretty good success as long as you're setting it up correctly. So if you have an animal that needs really high humidity, it's great to go through and give it a good spray down every now and again. It holds water really well and releases humidity pretty slowly. So you can see that this is pretty large particulate. The small fibers that are in here do help it to retain a burrow structure. So if you've got an animal that likes to dig around and root around in their substrate and make little tunnels and tubes, it'll hold up to that pretty well. if you've got one that's very specifically fossorial, there might be better substrates to use, maybe something that's a bit more naturalistic, depending on where that animal comes from. But if you're just doing a setup that you want to maintain with some level of ease, cocoa-based substrates are pretty good. I try not to use, unless it's for very specific reasons, just cocoa fiber. But cocoa fiber makes a great additive to bioactive substrates. You can add it to your cocoa husk chunks if you want like a bit of a finer bottom layer to help really cling on to some of that humidity and some of the moisture that you're adding to the enclosure. But as far as doing cocoa husk for different species, if you don't mist very often and you're kind of gentle, or a little bit more just kind of aware of how you're adding water and changing water out, not just dumping your water bowl into the substrate every time you go to change your water out, you can keep it relatively dry in there without having it be so dry that you're desiccating your animals and pulling moisture out of them through their respiration, through their skin. And you can also keep it pretty humid in there without having it be waterlogged and soaked and getting to the nasty side of things.
Hey, Nate.
Especially if you add things like sphagnum moss.
You kind of said it like almost, I'm not sure if it was sarcastic, because I take my water from the day before and add it to my substrate. Now, granted, I have bearded dragons and other reptiles, but is there something wrong with that?
No, if you've got a really dry climate animal, so if you've got an animal that can't tolerate super high humidity for long periods of time and you're doing daily water changes, at that point I would probably make more of an effort to not dump out the water into the enclosure. But if you've got something like a ball python or a boa constrictor or false water cobra or blood python,
Chinese water dragon.
Bearded dragons, you can do it with too if it's a small enough amount of water. I mean, they can handle up to, I want to say that it's like 40 and 50% humidity is pretty good
around
for them.
40. But I have a Chinese water dragon that likes it at 60, and I just dump his water out and keep going.
Yeah, that's a great thing to do, especially if you don't have like a huge paludarium set up for those guys, because that's a lot of work. That's a lot of filtration. That's water changes and all sorts of craziness. It's a lot of what most people would probably consider the worst of both worlds of keeping a reptile and some sort of aquatic animal.
Yep.
But so using things like I don't see it super often with snakes, and I'm really glad that I don't, but like crushed walnut shell is another one to avoid. It's really easy for that to get stuck to feeders, and if it gets into their system, if it's really small amounts, it can pass through. But a little bit too much of it, it goes a long way to stop up that digestive process, and it can lead to impaction relatively quickly.
It also gets at all the pet stores.
Yeah, there's a lot of substrates that they'll sell in pet stores that just are not great. I've unfortunately seen, in my personal opinion, way too many tropical or subtropical species of any kind of reptile or any reptile in general, period, on things like Repticarpet. It just breeds bacteria like it's going out of style. It's not impossible to clean. It's just at the point in which you're going through that amount of effort to clean your substrate, you would be better off using something like cocoa husk and then just scooping it all out when you do a deep clean, giving it a good thorough rinse, boiling it, and then putting it in your oven to re-dry it out. And then, you can add your moisture back into it when you go to use it. And that way you're kind of recycling it without having all of the nitrogenous waste, things that, you're trying to get rid of if you're keeping fish as well. Just waste products, feces, bacteria, fungal growth, things like that. You can really use and abuse some cocoa husk because it doesn't break down super well, or at least not very quickly. So you can usually get quite a bit of use out of it. It is a bit more of a process to clean than what a lot of people do, which is where they just scoop it, toss it out, get new, cocoa husk. But in today's economy and with the way that things are going financially for most people. And just the fact of just not being wasteful and causing more environmental damage and just keeping our substrates more sustainable for our environment as well. Going through and just doing a deep clean of your substrate, boiling it off, especially if you have a situation where you can do like a big outside boiler, like an outside barbecue. You just get a big old stock pot and, maybe halfway to 3/4 of the way with your substrate, just enough water to cover it. Just boil it off, make sure that it's nice and rinsed before you boil it. And then to make sure that it's not getting any kind of, moisture related fungal issues or anything, you can take it and bake it for a little while at a pretty low temperature. So that way it dries out again, and then just store it in a bin and keep it nice and in a nice, dry, cool place. So that way it doesn't have anything like mold or mushrooms or any other kind of funguses growing in there. But with some substrates like aspen, they can be a desiccant. They can pull a lot of water out of your animal. And I see that a lot when people are using aspen with things like ball pythons or other animals that are kind of a little bit more sensitive to humidity. And it just pulls a lot of water out of them really quickly. Not necessarily enough to cause issues with the substrate itself, but definitely enough to cause like shedding problems, respiratory issues, especially because aspen has a tendency to be a little bit on the dusty side unless it's rinsed, and then trying to get it dried out quickly enough so that way you can get it back into the enclosure it's a whole nightmare. So the main point there is that there are better substrates that are probably going to be cheaper in the long run. Investing in a couple of like Freedom Breeder blocks or Cocoa blocks. They're a bit expensive now. I know up here they're running around about like $24, $25 in some cases. Yeah. But considering that
Crazy.
if you do it right, you can, build up a good kind of base of that and just have it on hand, and then do a really good job of just cleaning out the substrate that you have when you do deep cleans and spot cleans. Just keep a bin of dirty and just clean it, dry it out, throw it in another storage bin. Then you don't have to go out and buy as much unless you're doing a whole new enclosure and it's going to be a real big setup and you need a lot of substrate and you don't have that much saved up. That can be really helpful for avoiding those kinds of situations where you're like, man, aspen's cheap, but when I got to keep buying it every couple of weeks, it gets to be just as, if not more expensive than buying a better suited substrate.
Makes sense.
You're doing
Okay.
real good.
I've got a couple of more dumb or stupid questions or whatever, and they may be things you're going to cover, but I surprise myself sometimes. One is the acidity. We're always concerned about the acidity of especially wood and substrates in aquariums. So is there any concern for any reptiles as far as acidity goes? I mean, I've
There
never
definitely
heard.
can be. It depends on the species, really. There are some animals that are very, very hardy. Reptiles in general have a pretty good setup so that way they don't lose a bunch of water and they're not absorbing a bunch of stuff that they don't need through their skin. The main concern I would have would be like if you're using something that has potentially, maybe it doesn't gas off a toxic compound or a potentially harmful or irritating compound, but if it's ingested, getting that kind of stuff in the digestive system, if you're feeding an animal, whether it's live, frozen, thawed, what have you, that substrate gets on your feeder, the animal that you're keeping gets a hold of that feeder or goes to grab that feeder, maybe misses and they get a mouthful of substrate. That could potentially lead to a bad time. The main concerns that usually we're trying to address when it comes to reptile substrates is going to be humidity control, cleanliness, and dust are kind of the big three, because typically those are the issues that you're going to kind of run into. Is going to be either too much humidity, so like if you're keeping where are you going? There you go. If you're keeping a drier climate animal on a mixture of cocoa-based substrate, you've got moss mixed in there and some leaf litter or something to that effect, and then, you know, oops, you accidentally add a little bit too much water, you get a little overzealous with the misting. If the rest of the setup isn't set up to where, or the enclosure isn't set up to where you've got good ventilation, and especially things like cross ventilation, you can end up with a lot of humidity building up in there, which for animals that are living in, let's say, drier areas like the gopher snakes. So a lot of those guys, they can handle humidity for short periods of time. They will go and seek it out when they need to shed, or if they're just feeling a little bit dried, you know, they'll go and they'll find a source of water or moisture to kind of hang out in, so that way they can relax and absorb some water, you know, subcutaneously through the skin, or water to drink or what have you. But you don't want a ton of humidity just ambiently in the air all the time with them, because if they're constantly breathing that very moist, damp air, where they, you know, especially if you've got localities like the Sonorans or San Francisco's, or just areas where it tends to be a bit drier during their active period of the year, you could end up with things like bacteria, viruses, fungal growth, things like that in their lungs, which is going to lead to some pretty gnarly respiratory issues.
My gopher snake is a San Diego, but I was thinking about getting a female Sonora, and I can get one here locally, and they're about the same size. Just to breed them, I'm sure that would be fine, but any opinion?
Yeah, I think breeding those guys together, it's mostly a locality thing at that point, which some people, you know, have really great success with mixing localities. Oh, look at you go. Oh, wow.
She's beautiful.
She's ready for her 15 minutes of fame. She's ready for the close-up, Mr. DeVille. She's been pushing her face in my hand.
She's being very patient too.
She's being very tolerant. I think she's hungry. She was a little bit chunky, so she skipped her meal this week. She'll be getting fed next week. And with high metabolism, and especially high intelligence animals like this, they know their schedule. They know when they're typically going to be eating. So she's been pushing her face into my arm and hands every time I get too close to her mouth, which to me is telling me that she's hungry, which is the worst possible bite to get from one of these guys. I would much rather that she, you know, something fell or something and she got freaked out and tried to just lash out to let me know that she's nervous and wants me to back up a little bit and give her a minute. Because when they're hungry, she can be an absolute savage. She used to be very, very calm when it came to food and was super gentle about taking it. And now she is 110% false water cobra appetite that we usually hear about, or even with other similar snakes like Trimarchin and things like that. She is quite the little firecracker.
I remember when you had to leave her food out and go away.
Yep, now she'll take it from me readily. I set some chicken liver down in her enclosure the last feeding that she got, and put a pinky mouse on top, and I hadn't even finished putting it down in the enclosure before she had her head popped out of her hide, and she's kind of looking at me like, you going back up so I can get a hold of that? Because I'm come and get it whether you're in there or not.
That made me think of a feeding issue I have, but I don't want to get us off topic. I'll ask you afterward if you'll remind me. It's a feeding question.
Yeah.
What about I can't ever say it. Moss, smegma moss. I can't say it.
So that's a really good additive. There are probably a couple of species that could do with that as just their primary substrate. It's really good for adding some humidity. You can add it to enclosures that are drier setups too, just so that way if there is water that gets in there, it has a little bit of a slower dissipation if you want a little bit of humidity to kind of hang out there for a little while, but not super long. But like for my blood python, she is on a mix of, not exactly sure the ratio. I'd have to go back in there and kind of look at what I've done in there. But she's got quite a bit of moss in there that goes in with some of that repti-chip stuff, the cocoa husk. And that does wonders holding humidity. So even if there's even if I skip a day of the usual misting, it's not that big of a deal for her, because she's got It's ventilated, but it's not super open and airy to the point where just humidity dumps out of it and I've got to constantly go in there and fuss with it. But I can go in there, do a misting once or twice a week, depending on kind of what's going on with our weather out here. You know, if it's super dry, I might have to do it, you know, a very light misting 2 times a week, or get in there and do a pretty moderate one time a week.
Vincent, that is a false water cobra. And Nate's had her since she was about half that size, I guess.
Yeah, she was about half the size. Man, they grow so fast.
Huawei wants to know which snake of yours do you least want to be bitten by?
So probably this one. They are mildly venomous. While she is still relatively small like this, there's only a handful of places that she could probably get one of those fangs in that would do the deed and get some venom into my system. But typically the way that generally happens is that you get a food response bite while you're handling because they brush up against your finger or something with their lip, or you're, trying to get away with sneaky stuff by like rubbing their chin, and she just decides that happens to feel an awful lot like when she's grabbing a hold of a meal and then decides to twist on you and get your finger. It's not typically, I don't think that there's been any recorded fatalities from it. And depending on the amount of venom that you get in your individual biology, the reaction to it can be anywhere from just unpleasant to not necessarily debilitating, but just it's one of those things where some people would probably end up getting rid of their false water cobra if they ever got a good chomp from them and got a real bad reaction. It's not a snake that I would advise to let bite you. And it's one that I would definitely urge people that if they are thinking about getting a false water cobra to really do the research on them. The husbandry itself isn't super difficult. The diet needs to be varied. They need a lot of enrichment, which means a lot of handling, a lot of time in the enclosure. I do what I can every time I put her back in the enclosure and let her kind of rest for the night after I'm handling her. I do a little bit of interaction with her while she's in her enclosure, just so that way we can kind of break down the boundaries of, when you come out of the enclosure, this is my space. And then when you're in your enclosure, that's your space. I want her to feel comfortable with people being in or out of her enclosure. And she does really well. She is very tolerant of, yeah, I saw that. I don't know if you're trying to burrow or if you're trying to get a nibble, but don't be doing that. You can hang out up here. Definitely one that just like every time I'm handling her, I keep a very close eye on where her mouth is. They're not what I would consider a beginner snake or an intermediate snake. They're a little bit more on the advanced side just because it's very easy to get complacent with these guys. And as we usually say in any kind of industry where you have to really, be mindful of safety, compliance kills. Not necessarily that these guys will do you a major harmful bite, but being compliant and just kind of letting these guys do whatever they want without having some sort of not control, because you can't really control anything that these guys are doing, but just awareness of what they're doing in a way to get out of that situation where a potential bite could happen, and really knowing how to redirect and handle and work with an animal. These guys are a bit of a challenge. Usually she's a little bit more calm and placid than this when I'm handling her. She doesn't quite move around as much. She's not super adventurous, but I think the fact that I'm talking quite a bit, the fact that it's nice and toasty in here, she's nice
hungry.
And warm. Yeah, she's really looking for places to just kind of post up. And these can be a very fast, agile, active snake, and they're excessively strong as well for colubrids. She's almost the size of a corn snake that would probably be like 2 years old, and she's not even a year old yet. These are a big, whoa,
oh, wow,
easy. These guys are a big, fast colubrid. They're very smart. They are not an animal to be taken lightly. When they throw a temper tantrum, it's a big temper tantrum.
Coro's asking if you have any experience or opinions on rough green snakes, endemic to Florida.
I would love to get some. I've never worked with them myself. They're not super commonly available up here, and I think that's in part because they are a U.S. native species, which doesn't often end up in the market. Out here, a lot of the snakes that we have out here are going to be things like this that are from South America. They're a bit more on the exotic side, which is a real shame. There's plenty of like ball python breeders up here and everywhere else. I mean, you can't hardly throw a rock without hitting somebody that's a ball python breeder, getting pretty close to it. I do have a friend that has had 3 of them, 2 or 3 of them. She really likes them. She said that they're a great snake. They're very interactive. They're very tractable when you work with them a little bit. They're not super difficult to tame down. Not one that I would recommend for small children, just because they're a smaller snake. They're very delicate. But for an adult or someone that's a little bit more experienced with working with small animals and that, definitely has a sense of being gentle and careful and, things like that. Great animal to have. The insectivore diet is going to be a huge boon for most people that aren't comfortable with feeding things like, chicken liver and hearts, fish, mice, rats, things like that, frogs, lizards, other snakes, things like that, might put some people off of keeping certain species. So having a diet that's going to primarily be similar things that you could pick up for a lizard, where you can just kind of throw a couple of bugs into that enclosure and kind of let the snake go for it. Watch them a little bit to make sure that there's nothing funky going on, but just for the most part, you don't have to worry about it quite as much as if you were putting a rat or, a mouse in there that's going to really be able to do some damage. That can be a great animal for people to start with or to have.
And what kind of snake was that you're talking about?
The rough green snake. So it's a small North American colubrid. They mostly eat insects. I think they can handle some other things like small frogs, maybe little teeny tiny baby lizards, things like that. But for the most part, they're going to eat things like crickets, flies, different kinds of worms and larvae, probably some small beetles here and there, maybe some snails, but mostly just invertebrate prey, which makes them really tractable for most people that just don't really feel that comfortable feeding something that has more of a face to their pet.
I've got a couple of African green bush snakes, and I've tried to get them to take crickets and worms and stuff like that, but they absolutely won't. It's got to be an anole or a lizard. They won't do it. Trash Cat wants to know if you've ever handled a gaboon viper.
So I've never handled a gaboon viper. I've been around a few of them. They're definitely one of those animals that if people can get the idea of I've got to hold it and handle it out of their mind, they don't seem like an excessively difficult snake to keep. They don't move around a whole lot. If you're kind of looking to get more towards something like that, or if you want something that's really similar and you are looking for a bit more of a very specific care kind of animal to where you can remove the care that you have to put into working around the animal and put more of that attention to detail and the work into just taking care of the animal, a blood python is a great substitute. They have a very similar ecology. They get a little bit bigger. They're not excessively difficult to keep. If you do your research, make sure that you're, getting the right kind of enclosure and just kind of, minding the cleanliness of the enclosure, which isn't super hard to do. They don't go to the bathroom all that often. So you're not going to be cleaning up a ton of feces on a regular basis, but you will be cleaning up a lot of feces here and there. So not super frequent use of the bathroom, but when they do, it's quite a bit. A lot of the times, even for smaller individuals, it can sometimes be about the size of like a small cat.
Wow.
The similar kind of feces size. So I mean, it's quite a bit of doo-doo to clean up when they do it. But they also are one of those animals that they're a very much like the definition of an ambush predator. They do active stillness, so they'll sit in the same exact spot for days or weeks or months on end, waiting for something to come through to eat. So they're not one of those animals that you're going to have to worry about being super jolty or active or crazy movements. They do have a really bad reputation for being nippy and bitey. Typically when they're young, they are a bit more on the nervous and more reactive side. Are you getting tired of my nonsense, ma'am? No, you're good. Okay. So typically they're during the first year is when they're going to be at their peak reactiveness. It's when you're going to probably get the majority of bites and things like that. Are you getting frustrated because you can't go anywhere? I know. You're fine. You're doing really good. You're being really patient with me and very tolerant, and I super appreciate it.
How long do you normally try to hold her?
So usually I'll do like 15, 20 minutes at a time.
Ooh.
Great. Once in a great while, I'll do like a 30-minute. Typically she's not this active though. So I think she knew something was up, because when I came home, I went in there and checked on her, and she was just kind of loud and proud, hanging out on top of her hide, basking. And she saw me and started kind of checking out what I was doing. And then when I went to get her, she was checking out the edges of the opening of her enclosure. So I was pretty sure that she was going to be fine to come out. But usually when I'm handling her, she just kind of picks a comfortable spot. She sits real still. And then when I put her back in her enclosure, she'll move around quite a bit. But today she is being very active, and I think it's because she didn't eat on Wednesday. So I think that she's in the process right now of trying to figure out what's food, where is the food, how can she get to the food. These are a very food-motivated animal. They love to eat.
And what makes you think that she needs to be like lose weight? What part, like what on her looks heavy to you?
So it was just she had a little bit of a fecal bulge going, which means that she's got stuff that she's still breaking down. She's not quite pudgy yet, but I am noticing that she's got enough weight on her to where she could honestly probably skip another week. But instead of skipping 2 weeks, I'll probably just give her a light meal. So she might get like a small quail or something like that doesn't have a lot of fat content to it. Just because these guys are prone to obesity with how much they love to eat. If you offer them food every day, they will more than likely take it very happily.
Wow. Okay.
Well, that kind of got back around to my other question, so I will ask it. It's about feeding. I have 2 fairly new rat snakes within the last 2 or 3 weeks. One is just a tiger rat, wild caught, 3.5 feet. And the other is a red-tailed green tiger rat snake. So the tiger took a couple of frozen thawed, also wild caught. The tiger took a couple of frozen thawed small but adult mice, and I was like, yeah, that was easy, but spit them right up immediately. I went back and found them. And hasn't taken anything since, won't pay any attention at all to live mice. The other one actually seems like it's afraid of live mice. And so I wondered about maybe trying something like, I asked someone else that, like yourself, knows a lot about snakes and reptiles, and she said, I asked if I could maybe get like a chicken, a boneless piece of chicken, you know what I'm trying to think, like a nugget, something like that, and see if the snake would be interested, either snake would like it. And she said no, not to feed something like that, to feed maybe a baby quail or something.
Yeah, and I think that, so for the most part, with any wild caught animal especially, one of the, aside from the issue of over collection from wild populations, one of the big reasons that it's in some circles frowned upon, in others just kind of like wouldn't recommend. They can be difficult to get to eat in captivity. So for a lot of them, it may be that they show absolutely no interest whatsoever in anything that you try to feed them, even if you have something like a frog specialist and you go out and, you know, do your due diligence and get them a good healthy frog feeder and offer it to them, and they just kind of look at it and then look back at you like, I'm not doing it. I don't care what it is or how you present it. I'm not going to eat it. And a lot of it just comes down to stress. Animals that come from captivity, even if they seem pretty tractable when you're handling them out in the wild, may take quite a bit of time to adjust to it. By the time they get to long-term captive, even simple things like slight changes in their husbandry. So if you're maintaining them at a good temperature and humidity for, 3 years, and then maybe for a week, just whatever, something happens, weather changes unexpectedly, and it's just hard to keep the room as warm, or, you miss out on a couple of mistings or something like that. Small changes like that can upset them to the point where they're like, all right, well, I'm not going to eat for 2 weeks, which can be really frustrating. The other side of that is just to double check all the husbandry points. I like to go through, and especially if I have any of my snakes that eat really well, that are very, very eager to eat every time I offer them food, if I offer them something and they kind of and snub their nose at it, the first thing that I do is go through and make sure, is all the lighting on? Is it working? Check any kind of bulbs to make sure that they're not old. And especially if you have, if you keep a log of your UVB bulbs of what enclosure the bulb went to when it was last replaced. Make sure that the UVB is good. Make sure that their heat's good, that it's not too hot, too cold. Throwing up can be from stress, it can be from illness, and it can be from improper temperatures. So some snakes are relatively good about knowing, it's not warm enough in here for me to digest this meal. And as much as it sucks, I'm going to sacrifice this nutrition that I've taken in. I'm going to dump it, and I'm going to hope that things improve. So that way, the next time a meal comes on and I can get a hold of it, that temperatures will be suitable for me to go through and digest that properly.
Okay.
But with the wild caught animals, there's any number of things that could be going on there. If that one's either refusing to eat or throwing up, is it a long-term captive wild caught, or is it a new captive wild caught?
It's my understanding they're both fairly new. And when I asked what they were eating, I didn't get an answer to either one. I got them 2 weeks apart.
So what you can probably do is, if you wanted to, as just a one-time thing, not even necessarily one time, but just, I wouldn't feed them chicken breast or chicken thigh meat. So just chicken meat, or even just chicken wings on a frequent basis. But you could take a piece of chicken and offer it to them and see if maybe they have more interest in bird than they do in rodents. If they are really just gung-ho for that chicken and they want it, and that's driving them, and they are really going after it with a gusto, you could probably even use that to start scenting rodents, so that way you can get them on a more balanced diet. But if you have the ability, if you've got a local hay and feed store that's close enough, go down there, ask them if they've got someone that works with quail, or when they're going to be getting in chicken chicks, which should be on a pretty frequent basis. It should not be hard to get chicken chicks. You can do turkey chicks, duck chicks. So I would do a real small meal at first, maybe even one that seems a bit too small for them, just to see.
I'm crying over here. I'm crying now because I love chickens and duck.
Yeah. I don't have anything against birds, but I will say that you are in many cases hard pressed to find a better feeder. Especially if you're looking at an animal, if you're getting an animal secondhand, or even from a breeder that, maybe they were feeding it a bit heavy to try to get it to grow. Or just, your animal's not been super, super active, or just they've been doing really good about just smashing through meals, and they're packing on a bit of weight that you're kind of looking at them and going, I'd like you to lean down a smidge bit. Birds of most ages are pretty good for a nice lean feeder. You can, especially if you can get your animal to readily go back and forth between rodents and birds. I alternate with these guys doing that. So that way, if I notice that they're putting on a little bit of a paunch, in it, I like to keep mine in a more athletic physique. I want to be able to see muscle tone. I don't want to see big fatty areas. I don't want to see a skinny snake either. I want just enough body fat to the point where in the wild, if they were to then not be able to get food for a couple of weeks, then they would be completely and totally fine after that. Which for each species can be a little bit of a challenge, because you've got to really do the research, really know what the physiology of that animal is, really understand what they're supposed to look like, and then find that happy medium of a healthy bit of body fat, but not a ton. But then I can go through and instead of feeding them rodents, which tend to have a little bit more fat to them, I can go through and feed off a couple of appropriately sized birds, for the next couple of meals. And I might notice that they're, slimming down appropriately. They're not crashing to the point where they're just dropping weight rapidly, but I can see a nice, even, going back down to where I would prefer them to be.
Well, of course, all the Tractor Supplies and co-ops and things have baby chickens and baby ducks right now, but I don't know that that's small enough. I don't know. But I may explore the quail thing, like at the market,
Yeah, because if you go to like a local breeder for quail, you can, depending on who it is, most of the time they're more than happy to, if you're like, look, man, I just want like 5, I'm just looking for 5 quail chicks. That's really all I want, or chicken chicks or what have you. You can kind of get them in a small or large quantity, depending on, what they're producing and how much and how often and all of that. So you get a little bit more control than if you were to go through like Rodent Pro or some of the other feeders. Rodent Pro is the one that I use. They're my go-to, or Jay's Long Meats, which is one that's up here. It's a local company. But with those guys, typically you have to, you're kind of stuck with getting whatever count they put in a bag. So they may put like 70 quail chicks in there. So you buy 70 quail chicks and then find out that none of your snakes have any interest in eating those quails. And Now you're just kind of sitting there going, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of these now, because nobody will eat them. Like I've tried quail eggs so many times with all of these guys, and they all kind of like, they approach it, they look at it, and they go, yeah, that's a really cool looking rock, man. I don't know what you want me to do with it. And then they turn around, they walk away, and I got to give them, the actual bird itself, or give them a rodent of some kind, or what have you. So if you can buy them in small quantities, I would say get 5 or 10. Chances are, if those two don't have any interest in them and they only want to eat rodents and they just need a little bit more time to settle in,
Yeah.
Then you can feed those off to the Great Basin gophers. They do really well with birds. My blood python goes ballistic for birds. She has mixed feelings about rodents. She'll grab them and eat them readily, no problems. But I think that something about the smell of a bird and what a bird is and what a bird can do really sets off I need to get a hold of this thing. I need to wrench it to the ground because they can fly. I need to wrap that thing up, and I need to hold on to it with everything that I've got, because when I offer her a bird, she puts on a spectacular show.
Oh, wow. Well, the gopher snake is right next door, actually a couple feet away, but apparently has pretty good vision, because he is always like, look at those mice, look, and he can see. He's kind of like in the middle, the same height, so he can see into both enclosures. And he's like, guys, look at those mice, they're mice, and he gets so excited watching their mice.
Yeah, I had one guy that has a ball python send me a message, and he's like, I fed my snake, she grabbed the mouse, she wrapped it up, she did all the things that she's supposed to, and then she unwrapped it, she went to start eating it, and then she just dropped it, let it go, and meandered off. Like, what do I do? And I'm like, dude, they basically have ADHD. Just give her, let it sit in there for another 15 minutes. she'll either find it again and go, oh, and eat it once she's done with whatever it was that has distracted her in her enclosure. Because some days, even though they've seen it 1,000 times, a particular leaf might all of a sudden be the most interesting thing in the world.
Coro's suggesting to check the Asian market, and they sometimes have fresh quail in their butcher section. I'll do that because we have an Asian market.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have one and you do have the other, both are great places to look. Whenever I've gone and gotten quail eggs, I've gone to Asian markets. Once in a great while, they'll even have frog there. You can go to a butcher too and see if maybe they have something similar to that. You can try offering chicken liver, especially if you're going the route of a butcher shop and, you know, maybe you want to treat yourself a little fancy. So you go down there and get yourself some nice cuts of meat and pick up a small bag of chicken liver or something like that. You can pre-portion those out, freeze them, thaw them out, just put them in a little dish and just set them down in there. And then if they're interested, they'll come down, they'll get them.
We've got about 5 more minutes, so maybe time for a couple of more questions. One question there says, are female snakes generally more aggressive?
It depends on the species. So the proper term for it would be defensive or reactive, which are both different things. So defensive is going to be an animal that is not afraid to kind of not quite pre-calculate, but they're a little bit more tolerant for a couple of, you know, they'll give you a little bit of a forgiveness before they post up and get ready to defend themselves. Whereas reactive animals, like right now, she's very focused on something across the room. So I don't think that she will, but if I go like this, if she were to have been so focused that she couldn't see my hand coming, or if I were to just all of a sudden have quickly reached for her, reactive would be like an instinctual, like a reflexive kind of thing of just like whip around, bite, or smack me in the hand with just her face to let me know, like, hey, you need to back up and not do that. Or she could whip me with her tail. So it just kind of depends on the species. More often than not, males might be the ones that are a bit more reactive into adulthood, just because they have a little bit more of that somewhat territorial behavior to them, or at least that more competitive side. Usually it's not a super great, here we go, a super big problem with them. Typically when you're going to see the most reactivity out of an animal is when they're babies. Or if they're wild caught, you might have, you know, prolonged periods of reactive and defensive behaviors from a wild caught animal. But usually when they're really young, they're really small, they don't understand that you're not going to hurt them just yet. So it may take a little while for them to kind of cool off. I've gotten really lucky with her to where she is extremely relaxed. She's only ever had one temper tantrum with me. And it was because we went outside. I think she was just smelling too many things, and there was just too many vibrations, too much light, too many smells, too many textures. I think she just got overstimulated and just was like, I gotta freak out right now. Because the second that I reached for her to try to get her back within arm's reach, she hooded up, she whipped around, she open mouth, gaping, hissing, and just was not having it. And then once I got her back in the house, she was like, oh, okay, well, everything's fine now. I was like, oh, I bet it is.
Wow. And she hasn't been out since, I guess.
Not yet. So that was late this summer, or this past summer. So this summer she's going to be going outside a little bit more. And I probably will do more of the shorter outdoor handlings. I'll probably handle her for maybe 5 minutes in the house and then go outside, handle her for 5 minutes, depending on how it's going, bring her back in to let her kind of, you know, adjust back to that safe haven feel, and then let her go back in her enclosure and kind of do our normal routine where I just kind of rub up and down her back and on her face while she's in her enclosure, so that way she doesn't just associate me with only food.
I'm going to go back and look at some of her early videos, and her pattern seems so different than what I remember.
Yeah, she was super, super dark for a hot minute there. She looked like almost like our North American water snakes, like the banded water snake,
Yeah.
or the Easterns, or even like a cottonmouth. And now she's just got this beautiful gold color. Her mom has a really nice, not quite white, but almost looks a little bit like a hypo. She's much brighter, a much paler color. Really, really pretty snake, and just absolutely massive. So I'm assuming that she's going to probably take after her mother, at least in the size department, and probably be very large, because she's not even a year old yet, and she's already quite the young lady.
Well, if no one has any other comments or questions, we'll wrap it up. Someone else is going live now, so we'll go over there and visit June at Only Oscars, and it's bingo night apparently. So if you're into bingo, Nate, hey, check it out.
Right on.
And let's see, let me bring our other panel member, our co-host, back up, Susie Q. Thank you, Susie. Appreciate you. And I know where she's going, and I know where I'm going. We were talking about how tired and sleepy we were right before. So thank you, Nate. It was well worth.
Absolutely.
I love
Yeah,
it.
thank you guys for having me on. It's always such a joy to come on here and answer people's questions, and get to delve into topics that I only usually catch a couple of glimpses of from other people's content. So I really enjoy getting to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive, and then kind of explore some of the more side questy, kind of side tangent, but still related questions. So always a pleasure to be on here. And if anyone ever has any questions about snakes, especially species that I keep, you can check me out on TikTok, Instagram. I've got a YouTube that I'm going to be starting to try to put a little bit more work into, especially once I get these enclosures done. Everyone's going to be getting upgraded and moved around in here. So hopefully I'll be doing some longer form content as well, which will be nice.
Yeah, I'd love to dive a little deeper to see what kind of schooling you went to become a master herpetologist. I think that's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very challenging course. I'm going to be going back probably this winter and doing their, they have like a captive management program that they do as well. So things like husbandry, advanced keeping, conservation breeding, things like that. So I'd really like to go back and get some certification in that as well, just so that way I'm a little bit more equipped to help people with a wider variety. But there was a lot of interesting stuff that I learned in that schooling about frogs and salamanders and stuff that, I've worked with before and I have some experience with, but not to that level. And at the very least, getting some of the resources and connections that I've got now that I didn't before, and just the vocabulary, taxonomic information. That was phylogeny is it's hard. But my Lord, does it make for some really interesting stuff when you learn that like these guys are related to ringnecks and hognose snakes. So they're all part of the same little subgroup. So that's really cool.
That is cool.
But yeah, definitely a worthwhile experience, but probably not for everyone.
Right.
It's definitely something that requires a lot of passion. It takes quite a bit of time to do. It takes a lot of effort, especially when you're balancing 7 snakes, and then the other more normal animals of the cats and dogs. A relationship, full-time job.
Dang.
Speaking of relationships, I'm going to have to, Susie, he did chew my charging cord. The parrot was looking at my cord, and I'm like, don't you look at that.
Oh boy.
So I've got to go get a charge cord. I'm sure that doesn't work. I wouldn't trust it.
Nope, don't.
All right. Thanks, Nate, again.
All right, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. And the